Hello there, Mike from Downtown Makeover. This is the first in a series of videos I'll be putting out on topics I feel are really important for Reno residents to know about. Knowledge is power, and when you are armed with the knowledge of how this city works, where it gets its revenue from, it'll help you understand not only what lies ahead of us as a city, the challenges, but also ask the right questions of your local and state elected representatives and the right questions of political candidates. Let's talk property tax. This is information based on a presentation at the June 15th Redevelopment Agency Advisory Board workshop. We'll start with the basics and dive deeper and deeper as we go along. So let's start with what is property tax? Property tax is, of course, a tax, the levy on real property and some personal property, but this presentation will focus on real property. It is a big chunk of revenue for all state and local governments, including school districts. It accounts for roughly 70% of local collections in Nevada. It is a really big source of the city of Reno's revenue. So why do local governments care what happens to property tax? Why do local officials care? Or the city manager? Well, for the city of Reno, it is the second most important revenue source, and this is statistically year over year. I'll cover what comes in that number one slot in a different video. The city of Reno has a fund called the General Fund, which is essentially what funds the city for the most part. If you owned your own business, it would be the account that you paid your employees out of, that you bought supplies for, that you made repairs out of. The C tax is the highest revenue source for the city of Reno, and property tax is the second. You can see here it is a significant amount. Property tax is the number one revenue source for the city of Reno's street fund. That's through a property tax override that voters voted on. The street fund helps the city of Reno manage 759 miles of streets, 22 miles of alleys, 13 miles of utility access roads, and 75 parking lots. Without this, we would not have the street system that we do today. So this gives you a pretty good idea of the importance of property tax as a revenue source. And it's not just us. For our neighbors to the east, it's also the number two source of revenue for their city. In Washoe County, it is about 50% of the revenue, so there's a little bit of a flip between the C tax and property tax for Washoe County versus Sparks and Reno. Right about now, you might be thinking, well, why should I care about this? Revenue schmevenue, right? It's the city's job to understand where their money's coming from. This doesn't affect us. Well, it does. You saw how property tax funds almost 30% of the general fund and nearly 70% of the street fund to maintain streets. Well, these are the things that the city of Reno's general fund pays for. Things like police, fire, 911, code enforcement, development review, maintenance of parks and pools and city facilities. Also, in redevelopment districts, a portion of the property tax above a certain baseline goes towards redevelopment efforts in that district per NRS statute. Some of the government services that are provided within the city of Reno limits are actually provided by Washoe County. And at the county level, those critical services that rely on property tax expand even further. Now that you know why property taxes are an important revenue source for multiple government agencies, let's take a look at how they're determined. There is a three-step process for how we figure out how much you pay in property tax if you own real property, and how much you pay on the annual basis for your property taxes. Step 1. Property value assessment. Under state law, county assessors must reappraise properties at least once every 5 years, but in Washoe County, we do it every year. New appraisals can be conducted with new improvements, new structures, or other changes that could affect a property's value before that property's next yearly appraisal. How is property tax value assessed? It's land value plus improvement value equals taxable value. Let's get into each of these. Land value is equal to the full cash value, market value of the parcel. There's no depreciation on land value. So improvement value is improvement made to that vacant market rate parcel of land that we just talked about before. You build a house. You build a mother-in-law's quarter for an existing house. You spend 300 grand remodeling your entire house, and then you get it reappraised to increase its value. That's all improvement value. Improvement value is depreciated in the state of Nevada. So if you have a structure that's worth $100, year one, it's worth $100. Then every year, up to 50 years, that structure is reduced 1.5% of its value. That's 75% by year 50. We are the only state in the nation that does this with depreciation in commercial and residential properties. So when you depreciate properties by age, you kind of need to look at, well, how old are all the properties in Reno? In the city of Reno, 51% of the properties are 30 years or older. Same roughly for Washoe County. And it would make sense that Sparks is a little bit less because it's a newer community. Currently, 24% of Reno's properties have already fully depreciated, and in the next 30 years, nearly three-quarters of properties in the city of Reno's inventory will be fully depreciated, assuming no growth. And this is again both commercial and residential. This number will be offset by some measure of new homes being built, but also Reno is running out of places to build without really expensive terraforming in the hills. All right, so we got land value, which we went over. We got improvement value, which we went over. Land value plus improvement value equals taxable value. How about that? The first piece of our overly complex mathing is complete. Let's move on. Next, we take that taxable value that we just calculated and we multiply it by 35%, which is the assessment rate, and that's going to be your assessed value. Easy. Congratulations, you've done step one. Give yourself a pat on the back and a round of applause for sticking with me so far. You took the property value, which was the land, plus the improvement value, minus depreciation, multiplied by the assessment rate, and that's your assessment value. Now we're going to figure out how much to pay on that assessed value, and that is step two. Step two, property tax rates. So currently, you pay $3.66 per $100 of assessed value. And remember, we just went over how to calculate that assessed value. That $3.66 is then split between Washoe County, the school district, the city of Reno, and the state of Nevada. City of Reno gets roughly 26% of each $3.66. And then we can dive even deeper down into our little tax rabbit hole and get a breakdown of how each entity funnels that $3.66. So you have your assessed value, you multiply that by the tax rate, and that gets your assessed taxes. But that's not it. Now we need to talk about the two elephants in the room, exemptions and abatements. Governmental entities, nonprofits, charities, and religious organizations qualify for full exemptions and pay no property taxes. These entities account for 97% of all exempt value in the city of Reno. And here's a list of the entities and agencies that don't have to pay property tax within the city of Reno and how much it costs the city. And you can see in the bottom right, it's about $21 million. I'm not saying that this is a good policy or a bad policy, it's just the way it is. Reno has the highest percentage of exempt properties from property tax in the entire state, even more than Vegas. And I'm not saying again that this is good policy or bad policy, I'm just saying this is the way it is and it doesn't help the situation. All right, on to step three. Thanks for sticking with me so far. We are almost done. We've figured out our assessed taxes and now we need to figure out how to apply property tax abatements to them. And this is probably what affects property tax the most. So, property tax caps were created in 2005 in response to economic factors, 3% on residential taxes and 8% basically on everything else. This means as an owner-occupied homeowner, meaning you live in the home that you own, and also qualifying rental properties, your bill can't go up more than 3% each year. Is this unusual? Well, I don't think caps are, but how they function in Nevada, oh boy. In California, for example, baseline property tax rates cannot exceed about 1% of assessed value, with some local jurisdictions tacking on a tiny amount onto that. And then assessed value itself cannot raise more than 2% a year, unless the property changes owners or isn't improved. And we'll get into that huge difference here in a moment. Because government is never that simple, this is a good time to mention that there is a caveat to that 3% or 8% cap. If you perform a major remodel that triggers an automatic reappraisal because of the permits you submitted for that remodel, yes, they are turned into the county, and yes, the county assessor sees those, your taxable value goes up. For example, adding square footage, remodeling a kitchen, finishing a basement, adding a bathroom, big stuff, not just cosmetic stuff. When the assessor calculates the taxable value of those new improvements, they multiply it by the assessor rate just like normal. However, the additional assessed value on the improvement is not subject to the 3% cap the first year. The full increase is layered on top of the cap and then merges into the total taxable value in year two, and then begins depreciating 1.5% a year on its own curve. And the resulting tax bill after that is then protected by the 3% or 8% cap, just like everything else on the parcel. So even though the new value does get added to the roll, and it can make your tax bill jump more than 3% in a given year if you do major improvements to your home, it does start eroding immediately. So remodels and new construction aren't just fighting to offset depreciation elsewhere in the city. Each one becomes a fresh depreciating asset itself the moment it lands. It's also important to point out from personal experience that not every improvement or repair that you do to your home is going to trigger additional taxable value. For example, in my house, my 1920 home, I've replaced the roof, I've redone the floors, I've completely replaced the water pipes in my house. I had to replace the sewer line in my house, $25,000 job there, replace the water heater, and all of that, none of that triggered additional taxable value to be added to my house that was anything more than the 3% cap. In fact, my tax bill has not gone up by more than $100 in the last 25 years since I bought it in 2003. I'll get more into that in a moment. So not everything you do is going to trigger a reappraisal on your house. And here's a good example of those tax caps in action with a scenario of a $3,000 tax bill. And this assumes that you didn't build a new house on the property or do any major remodels that would have triggered a reappraisal and additional taxable value. And you can see how the abatements affect this year's tax bill. So unless a home undergoes a major remodel which adds taxable value on top of that 3% cap layer that we talked about earlier, the fiscal impact of tax caps compounds over time as the property value grows faster than the tax cap. And as we know in Reno, property values have been soaring for what feels like decades now. And so at the end of year 30, assuming a 4% annual growth rate in assessed taxes, the abatement share of assessed taxes is going to be 24%. Assessed taxes minus abated taxes equals what you are going to pay. All right, congratulate yourself for getting through the 3 steps required to calculate property taxes. Finally, we're going to apply this to a real world scenario of 4 different age homes of the same exact home value. Also, shout out to the City of Reno for letting me use this information and this home comparison to create this information in a more digestible video format. This information is on their website at reno.gov/, property tax, including this comparison in particular. So thanks for letting me use it. I asked them and they said happily yes. So here we have 4 different ages of homes with identical property values. How might this happen, you ask? Well, desirability in Reno's older neighborhoods like Midtown, Old Southwest, Newlands, and the area west of Wells have home values in my neighborhood for homes that were built in 1920 and 1930 soaring as much as or higher than new 3-bedroom homes being built out in suburban neighborhoods. So that can happen. Here we go. So when you do the calculations, assuming that land value is equal to 25% of property value and replacement value is equal to 75% of the property value, this is what you get. And so the end result is older homes may pay significantly less in property taxes. I mean, I'm not attacking older homes. I love historic neighborhoods. I live in a home built in 1920, and I live here because I love it, that it's old. But it's just what it is and how the system was built. But my home, built in 1920 in Midtown, is probably equal in value because of its location to a home that is built new out in Somerset, yet I bet you I'm paying probably a third of the property taxes, even with all the improvements I've made to my home. That's just how the system was built. All of this culminates into my own experience with property taxes and why I was really inspired to make this video. So let's get personal for a second. Let's look at my home because I feel like I am the prime candidate as to what might be wrong with our property tax structure, as much as I hate to admit it. I bought my home in the early 2000s, and my home was built before 1920, so it has definitely reached that maximum depreciation of 75% at 50 years. I bought it for $147,500 on the border between downtown and midtown. This was before midtown became midtown. The neighborhood was really rough back then. That's why my home was so inexpensive. I had two burglaries the first 2 years I lived there. But I love old neighborhoods. I love old homes. This was the only old neighborhood that I could afford at the time in Reno, so I bought there. But then things gradually changed. Midtown grew into what it is today, and now my neighborhood's pretty desirable right between three commercial districts. Zillow says my house is now worth between 450 and 500 grand, and even if that's overinflated, which it probably is because it's Zillow, I know it's worth a lot more than what I initially paid for it 25 plus years ago. Now look at how little my property tax increased between 2004 and 2025. Almost 30 years, the lifespan of my mortgage, my property tax has increased less than $100. And that's after accounting for all the legit permitted home improvements I made, which did not trigger any taxable value, including replacing my roof, replacing my sewer main for $25,000, the joys of owning an old home. I redid my floors, replaced all the plumbing in my house from the water main to the fixtures. I replaced my water heater. I painted. None of that triggered additional taxable value above my 3% cap. And if I decided to sell this home today because of that cap and depreciation, the most the new owner would pay in property tax would be $19 more than what I'm paying now. So, what happens when you take my property and multiply it? The city of Reno alone last year lost $32.6 million in abated taxes. After adjusting for inflation, property tax revenue in fiscal year 2025 is essentially equal to fiscal year 2009. The older the community gets, the less we are going to collect in property taxes. So, as property values in the Reno area have soared far above that 3% cap as time goes on, you can see here how abatements have spiked in 2024 and 2025 and have been on a steady upward trend since 2015. So, that brings us to the growth paradox. And this is the area that I have the most conflict with, being an urban person. Because now you understand that new homes contribute more property tax base than older homes. Our city is aging and the system is designed for building. And that brings us to this growth paradox. If I had a dime for every time someone in my comment section or the comment section of other media about any redevelopment article said, we need to stop building, we need to stop growing, we need to stop building new homes, I would be a billionaire by now. So the problem is Reno is growing and it's growing quickly. You don't necessarily want to live in a city that's on the decline because that's not a fun experience. But nonetheless, Reno is growing whether we like it or not. People are moving here, jobs are being created. But you can't provide police, fire, parks, all the services that a growing city needs. You can't do that on a declining revenue source. And worse, you can't do that on declining revenue sources. So the system was designed to collect more money when we build. Yet people get frustrated with growth. They don't want growth, understandably. They don't want to pay more in taxes either. And they don't want sprawling new neighborhoods because that brings congestion. As Mr. Urban Downtown, nothing grates on my nerves and gets me more fired up than suburban sprawl. I can't stand it and all the problems it brings. Traffic, commutes, congestion, the fact that only 4 brown tent variations are allowed for a master plan community of 300 plus homes. But the paradox is, without constant sustained growth, our tax system, and thus every city service that relies on property tax, can slowly collapse in on itself as the rest of Reno's home inventory and property inventory ages and ages and depreciates and depreciates. Yet, as the city grows, it needs more firefighters, more police, more park maintenance staff as new parks are built on the edges of the city. So, what do? We can't just stop growing because we know what will happen as properties continue to depreciate if we're not offsetting that with new growth. So, what do? So now we come to those hard questions. The effect of this is starting to catch up on itself, as you saw in previous graphs. We aren't the only city in Nevada that is having this issue. Almost every municipality in Nevada is. With my line of work, I'm exposed to over 100 different public agencies in Nevada, and I know that Reno is not unique in the problems that it's experiencing with property tax. So what do? Do we ride this out and hope some trends reverse and not do anything? Do we do something at the legislature? Maybe reset depreciation or property tax caps when a home sells? That way we're not punishing people for the length that they own their home, but if they sell it, you know, I'm sure that real estate agents would say that that's gonna, grind real estate transactions to a halt. But I don't know, what do? I'm not an expert. This is why it's important to talk to your elected officials about this and talk to political candidates about this who are going to take office next year and ask them, what are you going to do about the growth paradox and property tax? As always, I really appreciate you watching this. I put a lot of time into developing this video. If you like it or don't like it, let me know in the comments how I can improve it, because I do plan on coming out with additional educational videos like this, with the next one being on C tax. And thanks for watching.